Welcome, g'day, good to see you. My name's Adrian.
I'm Jez.
It's Jez. And welcome to our first live discussion and Q&A on Monday nights. How do we keep coming up with these creative names for events?
Yeah, Q&A on a Monday night. Has that happened before?
No, we're the first people to think of it.
Have you ever watched Q&A on the ABC?
You often say to me, did you catch Q&A last night? And I just go,
It's pretty late,
was I supposed to? Never have a clue. So I didn't rip it off. But we called it that because that's what these nights are going to be for the next 5 weeks. We want the chance to ask big questions and wrestle with those issues together. So tonight we're thinking about the existence of God and how we can know him. So that's a big thing to wrestle with. And over the next few weeks we're going to have a bunch of different topics and questions and stuff like that. And we're hoping to engage with more and more people as the weeks go on and through the week gathering questions, but also having some live interaction as the night goes on where you can message in your questions. But tonight, to help us start thinking through this stuff, we've asked Jez to join us to answer questions and as I said, help us start thinking through this. So we're going to be listening to you a bit tonight. So I reckon it'd be kind of good to get to know you a little bit first. Mm-hmm. Can you tell us firstly, when did you start to believe what the Bible says about Jesus?
There's never a time in my life that I can't remember believing there's a God and believing that God was the God of the Bible. So I was born into a home which went to church, which taught me the things of the Bible. In fact, I still have the children's Bible that my grandma had given me, and so we read it to our kids, read that just before I came out here. So God, Jesus, the Bible was part of my life since I can remember. Mm-hmm. Probably wasn't until that kind of high school stage where I started to do is this real because it's real, not just because my mum and dad kind of taught me this stuff. So yeah, probably teenage years started to ask those questions. Yep.
Myself, I heard about Jesus from school and a little bit going to church as a small kid, but it wasn't until I got invited along to church as a young adult that I sort of started to think about Jesus, the Bible seriously and start asking the questions that you really need to ask. And that's why I valued that, the opportunity to ask questions, get answers, and that's why I really valued this kind of thing, the opportunity for whoever you are. Maybe you've been thinking about this stuff for a long time, maybe you're brand new to it, but to wrestle with big questions and ask questions as well. Now it's been a strange time of life for all of us, social distancing here on the coast. Jez, let us get a little bit more of an idea of what your life looks like. What's been the best and worst of that for you and your family?
Not a lot of social distance in my home. We got 4 young kids, and so it all feels pretty crazy. It's felt extra crazy, like a bunch of families. I think I found not being able to go out, not being able to. Kids went to a skate park today. Now that we can, that was cool. Yeah, so life's felt very on top of each other. Yeah, very closed in.
So is that good or bad?
I don't know if they're watching it. I think one of them might be watching. It's been beautiful. Loved seeing them every moment of every day.
That's good.
Yeah, so that's been full on. I've got out on the water a bit more. Can't go to the gym. Gym's been a way of keeping my head and my body healthy. So been enjoying that.
Well, I reckon exercise has actually been a big positive. I know, like this, you see like TV commercials and stuff, like the Australian government telling us, pouring millions of dollars in, get off your butts and go do some exercise because you're going to cost Medicare heaps when you get older. Turns out all they had to do was tell us we weren't supposed to go. You have to stay at home, and we all go, that's it, I'm buying a bike and taking up bushwalking. There's actually another funny thing going on. Near my place at East Gosford is a dog park. And it's just this little hill, And
Do they have like little slides for the dogs?
no, you go there. I've heard it called dog o'clock. All the dogs there partying, but because you can call dog walking exercise, it is getting some action. Heaps of dogs, and of course the weekend sports aren't on. They're spilling down on the AFL oval, and they're starting to head up on. And some of these dogs look exhausted. Like it's the third family member in the day that's taken it to the park. I'm watching them walk past my house, dragging them along.
Good excuse to get out.
Yeah, that's right. But there's some positive exercise. Now that's enough about us silly stories. I don't want to hear about that.
Not very interesting.
We're going to be talking about a big thing tonight: the existence of God and how can we know Him. As I said, we asked a bunch of people to give their questions in through the week, and we want you to do that more and more. This week, we're hoping to have loads of questions from people who have never wrestled with this stuff before. Or maybe you've been wrestling with it for a long time, but your questions. This week we do have a few people that have sent in questions from church here. Now they're genuine questions, but what we've done there, we've asked people to let us know what questions were you wrestling with when you first started asking questions about this, and also what questions have you been asked while you're trying to share what you believe about Jesus and the Bible with other people. But to sort of kick us off, before I hand to you, I'm going to play 2 little vids of people asking questions, and I'm going to read a couple, and then I'll throw it over to you for a little while. So I'll play these 2 videos to begin with.
Hi there. My question is, if God is good and if God is love, then why does God let bad things happen?
When I was checking out things about God, I had a question that was, something had to have created this world. How do we know it was God? And how do we know there wasn't anything before God?
I'll read this one. Why does knowing God matter? It's not like He's intervening in any way visible, in any visible way in this world. And I'll read one more before I kick off.
Before you do, let me jump in. I don't know if you want me to start talking yet or not, but that's a helpful question, because I'd want to suggest that there's no bigger consequences that could flow from whether there is a God or not. Like in terms of where have we come from, who are we, why are we here, how do we live, where is everything going? That hangs on the question of whether there's a God or not. So there's so much at stake.
But for this person, they feel like it makes no effect whatsoever to their life.
Yeah. So, well, good. Let's keep exploring what we've got through the night. But that's a helpful question.
Another 2, just quick. Which God? Whose God? Just one or many? And how can I be sure that God exists if I can't see Him? Now, to tell you the truth, you're not famous for giving short answers. We are going to try to answer quite a few questions tonight. We won't be able to answer every question that's come in.
Do you know what my daughter prayed at dinner tonight?
What?
Dear God, will you help Daddy speak quickly?
Oh, that's good.
Because you told me I have to be brief, so we'll see if God answers that prayer.
So we're going to have time for Q&A after, but we've said to begin with, can you speak for 15 minutes, no more, to help us start thinking through this issue that we're wrestling with today.
Yeah, good. And that question that we just had there is a great one to kick things off. What was it? Something about...
How can I be sure that God exists if I can't see Him?
If I can't see Him. See, that's getting at something critical about God, and that is His Spirit. That He's not bound by physical limitations like we are. So we can only be in one place at the one time. We're bound geographically. We have limited knowledge. We can increase that knowledge, but it never is all-knowing. We have limited power. And so what we're talking about here is, how do we know a God who is unseen? That I can't just kind of walk up to and touch and prod and poke. And here's something critical about this. If it's true that God is spirit and He's unseen, then to know God, God must make himself known. If God is spirit, not in the material, physical realm, but in the spiritual realm, then it must be God who makes himself known if we are to know that he's there. And has he done that? That becomes the question. Now, take it for a moment, maybe suspend disbelief for you, but take it that he has, and he has in a very specific way, made himself known in a very particular way. A question then comes for us, are we willing to get to know God on his terms, not our own? Imagine you're in a room, a big room, lots of doors in this room, they're all closed, and someone were to bring a message to you saying, God is behind door number 7. Would you be willing to go through door number 7 to meet God? Or would you go, no, actually I want God behind number 4 or behind number 6? Or actually, God should be behind every door. Now, we're going to come to that specific way that God has said, here I am in a moment. But just worth asking that question, are we willing to meet God on his terms rather than to dictate to him what they should be? Now, we'll come to that specific way that God has made himself known in a moment, but just really briefly, there are some broader clues that God has left us that we might know that he is there. Firstly, the fact of our existence, the fact that we are here. It's commonly acknowledged and agreed by scientists that the universe had a beginning, and that it's not eternal, that there was actually a point where the universe came into being. There's a couple of reasons for that. The second law of thermodynamics, that the universe is running out of usable energy. If that's the case and the universe had existed for eternity, it would have run out of energy by now. But also the scientific observations that the universe is expanding. So it's actually come from a particular point. And so it begs the question, how did something come from nothing? There was a question up there just before, like, where has this all come from? And so to say that, well, something has come from nothing doesn't seem very satisfying or reasonable to many people. It's just not the way things work. A hamburger in front of me just doesn't appear. Its beginning has a cause. Things just don't come from nothing. So there's the fact of our existence. But then secondly, there's the complexity of our existence. As is also now pretty commonly known, our universe is so finely tuned that even if the force of gravity were off by 1 part in a million, the sun, the earth wouldn't have come to be. Life wouldn't be as it is. And so that's actually one of the great blessings of science, is that it's shown us just how amazingly complex and intricate this natural world is, and how staggering that we are here at all. Now, of course, Christianity offers quite a simple answer to those questions, the fact of our existence and its complexity, and that is that we haven't come from nothing, we have actually come from a creator, from a God who is self-existent. So just to speak to that question that came up there before, everything that comes into existence needs a cause. The universe has come into an existence with the cause. God didn't come into existence. So there is no cause that gave rise to God. God, by definition, is self-sufficient life in himself. And so the Bible's offering that there is a God there who has given rise to this natural world. And the fact that it is so complex, beautiful, amazing, finely tuned, points to a God who is immensely wise, beautiful, powerful. So there's just a couple of hints, clues, broader clues that God has left, that he is there. But for the sake of time, let me cut to the clincher, which kind of speaks to the second part of our question tonight. Is God there, and how do I know him? Because God has actually done something very amazing in that he has entered into history. So you've got philosophical arguments about whether God is there, you've got moral arguments, you've got cosmological arguments, and then you have history. And you have the claim that this unseen God, like how would you know this unseen God unless he's made himself known, has actually spoken words through history. This God is actually a speaking, communicating God, which is why the Bible is such a staggering book. It's not claiming just to be a bunch of pithy sayings or words from gurus, but actually the very words of God to humanity, so that we might actually know the unseen God. But here's the thing that the Bible does. The Bible then focuses in on this one particular event in history, the Jesus event. When the claim that this unseen God actually steps into time and space so that we might know him. The Bible's got a bunch of places where it speaks to this. This is in one of the accounts of Jesus written by John, one of Jesus' disciples. In chapter 1 there, we read, "No one has ever seen God." God is spirit. God is unseen. He's not bound by physical limitation. "No one has ever seen God, but the one and only Son, who is himself God and is in closest relationship with the Father, has made him known." Words about Jesus, that God has actually stepped into human history onto planet Earth to make himself known. Now these aren't words just written about Jesus, but you find this over and over again on the lips of Jesus. So a few chapters later, John chapter 9, we see that Jesus said, "Whoever believes in me does not believe in me only, but in the one who sent me. The one who looks at me is seeing the one who sent me." Who's he talking about? He's talking about God. He's talking as the Son of God who has been sent by God, making that massive claim. Did you hear it? Anyone who looks at me, Jesus, is seeing God. Just catch the significance of that claim, that in the first century you could have gone down to buy fruit and veg from the market and brushed shoulders with God without possibly having realised it. Such a staggering claim that this unseen Spirit God, who's eternal, actually in a moment in time, in a real place, entered into our world so that we might see him, that we might know that he's there, and more than that, more than just know that God is there, but know what he's like, know his character. So if you want to know what God is like, the Bible is saying, look to Jesus. Here he is in the flesh. If you want to know what God is on about, what's his purposes, then look at Jesus. Now, I get it that at that point, the person out there who's possibly a little unsure, sceptical, heard lots of religious claims, goes, come on, that's just another religious claim. Another guy claiming to be a guru, with a special connection to God, claiming to be God himself. But again, this is where Christianity does something very unique in history, and it hangs on the claim of the resurrection. The claim that this Jesus who came, who if you looked at you saw God, if you listened to you hear the words of God, would actually be executed by Roman executioners, people whose gig it was to kill people for a living. They knew what they were doing, they did it well. That Jesus would be killed by them. That his body would be placed in the ground and be subject to all the natural laws, decomposition, decay. And yet 3 days later, this man be raised to life, bodily, physically, and enduringly. This is the claim of the resurrection, which hangs at the centre of Christianity, which Christianity says, hey, push and prod this historical claim to see whether God is really there. Now, there is so much that we could say about the resurrection, and I've only been given a few minutes, so here I'm just trying to give you a taste of the good reasons we have to believe that God is there and what He's like, particularly as we push and prod the resurrection. Let me give you just two evidences which are very compelling. Firstly, how early the claim of the resurrection is. So it's easy to say, oh, resurrection, yeah, it sounds like a pretty good religious myth, legend, you know, that there was this kind of good, impressive man called Jesus, but 300, 400, 500 years later, this big myth and legend developed around him dying and coming back to life and being God. The problem with that is, again, just the facts of history. We have the claim of the resurrection in some of the earliest documents we have from the first century. So one of them, for example, is a letter called 1 Corinthians found in the New Testament. And by the way, this will be the subject we push into next week. We focus on the Bible, why there are good reasons to trust it and so on. But this document, which is written by the Apostle Paul to a group of people in the city of Corinth in the year 55, 56 AD, he writes to them about the resurrection of Jesus. But he doesn't just make the claim, he says, Jesus appeared not just to one person at one moment or just a small group of people, but to over 500 people at the one time. And he says some of these 500 plus people who witnessed this resurrected Jesus, some of them have died, but most of them are still alive. The implication being, if you think this is nuts, if you think this is crazy, then just, hey, head over from Corinth, just head over to Judea, to Jerusalem, and ask these people who were there, who saw it. You don't give that kind of information, make those kind of claims, unless you're confident that if people follow you up on that, they're going to find witnesses to what he's talking about. So there's the first compelling reason for the resurrection, that it's early. The claims of it are right after the life, death, resurrection of Jesus, rather than being a spiritual religious legend. But here's a second compelling reason that the resurrection is a fact of history, pointing you to the God that is there in Jesus. And that is the radical changing of lives. So I just mentioned Paul, the Apostle Paul, who wrote this letter to the Corinthians. The thing about Paul is he was a Jew. He was a very devout Jew, and he hated Christianity. Christianity was this emerging movement around Jerusalem, around Judea, and Paul saw it as a great blasphemy that it would be claimed that God actually died and then came back to life in the person of Jesus, showing him to be God there, God knowable. And so the Apostle Paul actually makes it his mission to go and take down Christians. We see that he heads out, not just in his own hometown, but around the place to imprison Christians, to persecute Christians, even being a part of the killing of Christians. He hated it. Didn't believe it was true, didn't believe Then we have all of this evidence, the overwhelming amount of evidence of the Apostle Paul, who spends the rest of his life travelling around the world proclaiming that this Jesus is alive and that this resurrected Jesus is the Son of God, the one that you would come to know if God is there and what God is like. What happened? How do you explain such a radical 180 in the Apostle Paul? Well, he puts it quite simply. He met the resurrected Jesus, and his life was radically changed. Now, it wasn't just Paul, though. What about the rest of the earliest followers of Jesus who had followed him as he was, heading around teaching, doing amazing things? They're his tightest kind of crowd. Then Jesus gets to the eve of his death, and do you know what they do? Out of here. They ran, they fled, they abandoned Jesus. In fact, they tell us that they were hiding in a home, locked, the doors locked, for fear that the same fate might be coming for them. If they've done this to Jesus, then maybe we're next. So you get these self-confessed cowards, hiding behind a couch. Then you have, again, stacks of evidence where these same men are standing in the middle of the city of Jerusalem, proclaiming that you, people out there, killed the Lord of life. You killed the Son of God. What changed them? Now, you might go, well, maybe they wanted to create a religion. Maybe they wanted to create, some big following and get lots of good stuff. And the problem with that is, as you read the historical accounts of these men and women, they suffered massively. They would go to their deaths, many of them, for declaring that Jesus is alive. How do you explain that? How do you go from being a chicken behind the couch to being willing to be crucified for the claim that Jesus is alive and is the Son of God? And so you have this compelling, powerful evidence in the radical life change of the people who were there at the very beginning. So there's just a couple of tastes as to the truthfulness, the fact of the resurrection, that it really happened in history, which the Bible is putting forward, saying, God's there. He's come in the person of Jesus. There's much evidence that points to that being true, the resurrection being significant. So, look, there's a quick flyover. I don't know if God answered my daughter's prayer about, was it 10, 15 minutes? But
almost.
But a bunch of, what, I'm under, am I?
No.
Have I got some more time? There's a bunch of different clues, a bunch of different reasons that as people come to and wrestle with, but then particularly the historical reason, gives us good reason to believe that God is there and that he can be known.
That's good, very helpful. As I looked at the questions that came in through the week and heard what you said there, I thought this one could be a good one for us to wrestle with. So you've pointed out that there's the resurrection in history is a unique thing for Christianity, a point in history that we can test and prod and sort of see if this is true or not. But someone has asked here, why doesn't God just show up and give everyone a clear sign now that he's real, rather than a 2,000-year-old book? So you've pointed to the Bible. You've said, that there's a great piece of evidence. It's in history. This person feels that, if God's real, if he's alive, if he could just turn up, why wouldn't he just do that?
There's an assumption in that question, and I'm trying to do the thing that men can't do very easily, which is two things at once. I'm trying to find somewhere in the Bible and talk. There's an assumption in that question that if God did something spectacular, then I would believe. Like, name your miracle, name your sign. Like if God, boom, did it, then there would be no option but for me to believe that he's there, that he's real. I think that's the assumption that sits in that question. The interesting thing, though, is 2,000 years ago, a man comes along and does stuff that had never been seen before. This man comes along and he feeds 5,000 people with 2 bits of fish. Now, were the disciples gullible? Did they, He walks on water. Was that an illusion because there's actually a shallow part? He restores the sight of blind people, like with a word. They can see, like not eye surgery, he speaks a word. He raises the dead. He starts doing all of these amazing miracles. Now, given that question, well, surely everyone would believe. See if I can find what I was looking for. We read that even after Jesus had performed so many signs in their presence, they still would not believe in him. Now, signs there is the word given to miracles. So, the chapter before, Jesus has raised Lazarus from the dead, a dead man. Chapter 9, this is John, by the way, the Gospel of John. Jesus has healed the sight of a blind man. And so on and so on. Chapter 6, feeding 5,000. And yet, even after Jesus has done all these things, people would not believe him or believe in him. So there's more going on than just show me something spectacular and I'll believe. Because even in the time of Jesus, the spectacular did not necessarily equal belief. Yeah. In fact, often it just hardened people all the more, and people sought to kill him. So just be very careful that it's easy to throw that thing out there, right? If God would do this spectacular thing that only I've conceived of, and boom, then I would believe. Would you? It's worth reflecting on: is this question of the existence of God merely a rational one? Like, is all we need is a good, airtight, rational argument, then I would believe? Or is there more going on? And I want to suggest there is, that there's actually, it's not just a rational thing, but it's something of the will. Is it possible that we actually don't want there to be a God, so that it doesn't matter what evidences or what rational argument I or anyone puts out there, we would find a way to dodge that?
We haven't got this question, but I feel like hearing that, there could be people saying like, is it possible that some people don't want there to be a God? Is it possible that some people are just desperate for there to be a God? So the people who want a God see a God, people who don't see a God don't see the evidences.
Absolutely. A question I'd ask there is, can they both be right?
No.
Can someone who just desperately needs a God to get through life, therefore there is a God, can that person be right alongside the person who goes, that's for the weak person, face facts, we're here on it. No. So they can't both be right. And so now the question is, are there evidences, are there good reasons that we can dig into to see whether this is not just wishful thinking, but whether this is actually grounded in reality?
Got a pretty interesting question here. I think a lot of people might resonate with this. Isn't it arrogant to say Christianity is the only way to know God? Aren't other religions trying to do the same thing too? Surely God would appreciate that they tried to know him. And I've sort of got a few here under the title of what about other religions? That idea, is it arrogant for one group of religious people to say this is it and this is the only way, and our idea of God is the only God there is?
Yeah, it's a good question, and one that I actually get asked a bit. I got asked this just the other day around my own dinner table. I'm bringing my dinner table a lot to this conversation. So particularly, as my kids, for example, mix with other people in the community, not closely at the moment, but, come across a Muslim friend at school, come across a friend who's heard nothing, it does this very helpful thing, I think, for kids. It makes them go, hang on, who's right? Are they all right? Can they all be right? What's going on? Are we being arrogant as Christians say, by claiming that Jesus is the only door. Is it... who's the fastest man across 100 metres at the moment, world record? I think it's still Usain Bolt.
It was Bolt, I don't know now, yeah.
Yeah. Is it arrogant for Usain Bolt to make the claim, I am the fastest man over 100 metres on record?
No.
Not if it's true.
Yeah.
Could he say it in a way that's arrogant? Of course.
I think he does.
Some people might think that he does. But the fact of the claim and the way that you might go about the claim, they're two different things. So is it arrogant for Christianity, for Jesus to claim to be the only way to God? Not if it's true. In fact, Jesus says exactly that. John's a great gospel to pick up and read. I haven't moved outside of John yet, but chapter 14, Jesus says, I am the way and the truth and the life. No one comes to the Father except through me. The Father, he means God. No one comes to God except through me. If you really know me, you'll really know my Father as well. So I used the door illustration earlier. Jesus himself uses that illustration. Again, go back to John chapter 10. I am the gate, he says. So is that arrogant? Not if it's true. Ask the second question, does Jesus go around arrogantly? Well, again, I'd put the challenge to you to read Jesus for yourself and answer that for yourself. Do you come across a man who is big-headed, arrogant, rubbing it in people's faces? I'd put to you, not at all. You come across a man like no other, who can actually speak truth with great grace, who actually, particularly to the broken and to the wounded and to the weak and to the outcast, will never compromise, but speak with such grace. And to the religious, to the arrogant, to the big, he will confront. So read Jesus for yourself as to whether he walks around arrogantly. The thing here is it true? Because if it's true, it's not arrogant.
Couple questions from that have come in tonight while we've been up here. So I think they're around the second part.
We do have some people watching.
Yeah,
that's nice.
Watching.
This is weird. It's just you, me, and a camera. We got no idea.
And anyone else here is just like keep quiet.
Except your stomach.
Yes, I'm sorry. A whole way through Jez's
I'm just
talk,
going.
I'm like, be quiet. You're going to distract the guy.
Are you hungry?
I did. You were like holding it in. No, I just had spaghetti bolognese.
Oh, that'll do it.
So, and I think it's around the second part of the topic. How do we know God? So I've got a question here. How do you build a connection with God? How would you know his voice from your own voice in your head? There's a question, but then also another question related to it. God is spirit, and Jesus was a historical figure 2,000 years ago. How do we know God? How do we build a connection with him?
Great question. And the most frustrating thing someone asked a question can say is, tune back in next week and the week after when we really hit that stuff. So tune back in next week and the week after. So next week, the Bible especially. And then the week after, we're going to consider what is a Christian and how do I become one.
Yeah, that's right.
But a quick crack at it. How do you build a connection with God? What are the options that God has for making himself known? There's a few, aren't there? He could bring such a vivid dream to you and speak to you in a dream that wow, God spoke to me. Now, he could do that. The problem, though, and I'm trying to engage, there's a few parts to that question or a couple of questions. How do you then go, you wake up so convinced, but then by the end of the day, by the end of the week, was that really God speaking to me, or was I just, I watched, my wife started watching, what's that Tom Hanks movie where the plane crashes? Wilson, whatever that movie's called. Castaway. You then go to bed and you have this dream that, a plane crashed, and is that a word from God? Don't get on a plane anytime soon. But hang on, I just watched a movie, but it could be God, couldn't it? Like if God is there and God is all powerful, now I'm in this, how do I know? So that's a good part of the question. So what God has done is something super helpful. It's something that's objective. The dream is subjective, doesn't mean it's necessarily untrue, but it just means you can't verify it. You can't push it in product. You have no access to my dream, I have no access. And so what God has done instead, though he has at different times spoken to people through dreams and visions, he has done that and then actually put a word about who he is and what he's done objectively. So this is what throws to next week. The Bible. He's actually given us words that we can all turn to, that we can all look at, that point to the God who is, rather than us having to rely on intuition or a dream or an experience. So how do you build a connection with God? So we're particularly going to push into that in a couple of weeks' time. But by coming to the place that he's revealed himself. And he's saying, I've actually given you words to come and connect with me. See, words can't be disconnected from a person, can they?
No.
If I went home frustrated with you and started telling my wife about how much Adrian ticked me off today, it's probably because you've said something.
Yep.
Now, I didn't go home and go, I'm so ticked off at Adrian's words. I'm ticked off at Adrian. Like, you can't disconnect our words from our person. And so by saying we come to an objective place to meet God in the Bible is saying we're coming to connect with God himself.
And that's why being able to trust the Bible, to know that it's reliable, is such a big deal.
Totally. And that's next week.
Yeah.
How do you know this? How do you know you're in touch with those real words? I mean, I've read a bunch already tonight, but many of them just seem so ordinary. Like what we've been reading are just historical accounts. When all the people were listening to Jesus, he said to his disciples, beware of the teachers of the law. Like, how do you know that they're actually God's words can be trusted next week?
Now, I did want to jump back right at the start, played a couple of vids, one from a young lady. She brought up the idea of if there's a good, sort of loving, all-powerful God, then how come there's suffering in the world? And so do those two things sort of contradict itself to the point where, do they mean that, God isn't there, he isn't all-powerful and he isn't all good because there is suffering? Now, we've got that idea come through in a bunch of different questions or statements quite often, but I do have another question here on the topic, so I'm going to play that and then I'll throw it to you.
Hi there everyone, it's Garth from Erina here. I'm only relatively new to the church at Erina, but really looking forward to coming back and meeting everyone and being able to share in the church together. Look, my question is, given that everything that's happening in the world at the moment with coronavirus and restrictions, how can we be confident that there is a God and that God is good? We seem to be going through so much pain and anguish and death and sickness. It would be it'd be nice to be confident and that there is a God, and how can we be confident in that?
Yeah, so that's kind of like the nicest. Yeah,
it's good to meet Garth just before COVID hit, and then look forward to seeing you in person soon.
Right. That's kind of like from someone who's I guess maybe warm-hearted to these things, and he's saying it'd be good to be sure. But then I've also heard the same question, far more aggressive. There's suffering in the world, which means there cannot be a powerful, good God.
Disclaimer here. I've been attempting to answer people's questions about the Bible for quite some time now. Not as long as other people, but in the, I think, 10 plus years I've been doing this, I still haven't come across the answer where I've seen someone go, oh, wow, just you nailed it. It's all falling into place. That to say, this
Don't
is...
get your hopes up, Gar.
This is such a big question.
Yeah.
The question of suffering, the question of evil. But it's not just a big question for Christians, it's a big question for everyone. How do we make sense of the world that we live in? Much beauty, yes, but so much brokenness. That said, there are a couple of things that I have found are helpful to get people considering it further. So I think the first question we saw up top, if God is good and God is loving, was it so why is there so much suffering in the world? So that's a question of purpose. Why? What purpose does suffering serve? And it's not uncommon for people to go, there seems to be so much suffering that people don't deserve. What's the point of that? And because there seems to be so much suffering that just comes on people, then surely there's no God. Consider this though, that we often come to that conclusion with this assumption that if there was a reason for suffering, if there was a good reason for suffering, then it ought to be clearly obvious to us. There ought to be this clear reason for suffering, then I can accept there's a God. There's one man who gives, I found it a helpful illustration. Do you know what a no-see-um is?
No.
A no-see-um is a tiny, tiny mosquito. Big bite though, packs a big punch. But you can't see it, so it's got a no-see-um. You just got to know what a no-see-um is, right? If you walked past a dog kennel and you didn't see a Labrador in it, it would be reasonable to conclude there's no dog in it.
Yep.
But if you walk past the kennel and you don't see a no-see-um, it wouldn't be reasonable to conclude there's no little critter there.
Yep.
Because it's so small you can't see it. Just because you can't see it doesn't mean that it's not there. I don't know if that illustration helps you or not, but the point is, just because we may not be able to see a particular reason for the suffering in the world doesn't mean that there isn't one. Particularly as we acknowledge the limits to our knowledge, the limits to our wisdom. So it doesn't follow, that the logic just doesn't follow that because I can't conceive of good reason for there to be suffering, there can't be a God. The other part of the question though, I think that Garth touched on, how could we be confident that God is good? Because what is clear is that there is a lot of suffering in the world. The Bible is insisting that there is a God and that He's good. See, this would be solved very quickly if there is a God and He's not good. Maybe like the kid playing with a fly who rips the wings off a fly and watches it, squirm about. Is that God? Well, the Bible says from cover to cover, no, God is light. In Him there is no darkness. God is good. And yet there is suffering. How can we be confident that God is good, even in the face of great suffering, where we might not have the particular reason for that suffering that we'd long for? This is where there is such a deeply satisfying reason that the Bible gives, and it's that God hasn't remained separate, aloof, distinct from the suffering, but rather has entered into it. By coming as the man Jesus, He's experienced the human lot in all of its brokenness. How can we be confident that God is good even in the midst of suffering? Because he didn't just sit back and go, gee, that didn't go too well, maybe we'll try another world. He stepped into it, he tasted it, and you've got to ask, why did he do that? More on that in coming weeks. But he did that to actually deal with the needs of those who suffer. How can we have confidence that he's good? By again looking to Jesus. Yeah.
That's good. I reckon, as we answer questions, we might, more questions might even come up for you. We're not going to get through all the questions that we've got, but please email them in or put up an email address later on, and also keep messaging them in, and we'll have a chance next week to keep answering them as well. This is a really interesting, it's not really a question, but it's a statement. And as I said, some of this stuff has come through to from people who come to church here. But this is from someone who was seeking, in the current situation we're in, COVID-19, they were seeking to share their faith in God and the joy and confidence that gives them. And this is the response they got from the friend they were speaking to. In a universe we're barely beginning to understand, we're just specks of intelligence, the concept of an overriding almighty being pulling the strings creates greater fear in me than the current situation. So this person is considered a God who's in control and with the struggles in the world, and finds that a terrifying, God being in control, real, and isn't a settling thing, it's an upsetting thing. What would you say to that person?
Well, there's two parts that the Bible insists on. That God is in complete control of the world. The word used is sovereign. That is, you don't have God, he makes stuff, and then there's these competing forces, or these other competing spiritual unseen forces, and it's this battle. But you have God who is in complete control over all things. Now, it's not the picture of a puppeteer strings pulling the strings on people, because the other thing that the Bible insists on is that people are moral beings who make real choices, who are therefore responsible and culpable. You can't hold someone responsible unless they were morally able, culpable. So you have the Bible saying two things: that God is in complete control, and we as humans make real choices. So the thing for this person to reflect on is the decisions that we are making are very real. There's not a fatalism. The Bible knows nothing about kind of fatalism, puppeteer. Choices are very real. God is in control. So the question is, just back to the previous one, is he good? Is there evidence, good evidence, that he is actually good? And this is where, again, I would point you back to Jesus, which the Bible keeps doing, that God's revealed himself. He's pulled back the curtains. Here I am. Have a look at Jesus. Then if you can see by looking at Jesus that God is good, you can actually have great confidence. Why? Because a good God is in control. This is not COVID versus God. Yes, begs big questions about how does God overrule the world without actually being the source of anything evil. But if you can show that he is good, that he is in control, then that's a great comfort. And again, back to that previous thing, just because we might not be able to see the particular reason doesn't mean that there isn't a reason, and that there isn't a greater good that actually God is able to come to through great hardship.
Not ages, hopefully a couple more questions will squeeze in. But yeah, a couple of people have asked questions around where did God come from? So how can God have existed forever? Like who made God? And Lachlan said before, how do we know that something wasn't there before God?
Yeah, it's one of those questions like, well, okay, who made God? Oh, that being, that God. Okay, well then who made that God? Oh, that. Bible doesn't do that. Everything that came into being has a cause. The universe came into being, the universe has a cause. The cause of this universe then, this material universe, needed to be outside of time and space as we know it, because time and space came into being from a particular point. So this cause needed to be outside of time and space as we know it. Needed to be immaterial, not material, because it's from this point on that the material reality came into being, so it needed to be immaterial, and needed to be insanely powerful. So what you have there is then what we find when we open the Bible, the Creator God, the one who is outside of time and space as we know it, not bound by it, is eternal, and is spirit, is immaterial, is incredibly powerful, has life within himself. Let me just give you a couple of verses again from John, this chapter 1. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. He was with God in the beginning. Through him all things were made. Without him nothing was made that has been made. In him was life, and that life was the light of all mankind. So in this Word who is with God, who is God, is life itself at the very beginning. Then you come down to a few sentences later. This Word became flesh and made his dwelling among us. It's talking about that event that I've been talking about tonight in history, Jesus. So the eternal God, in a moment of time, actually put on flesh, actually took on him, upon himself, something that was now new, profound. So that, not so that, you could come and check out this world that he made and wonder what it's really like. Come and get a first-hand glance at the place. So that we might know God. We might not just know that he's there, and not just know about him, but know him. Actually have a relationship with this eternal God. Christianity is not about rules for life, but coming into relationship with the God of life, the God who gave rise to all things.
Now I'm going to squeeze in two more questions. This one you've touched on it earlier, so I'm hoping it won't be, hoping you'll be able to get through it relatively quick. But basically, for someone, one of your answers to one of the last questions didn't cut it really. So there's a bit of pushback,
That's
which
all
is
right.
good.
Honest audience.
Yeah, so
Can't promise this one will solve it either.
on why doesn't God perform miraculous signs now? Our point was some people, even when God showed up, did miraculous things in Jesus, many people didn't believe. They pointed out here, many people didn't believe, but many people also did believe. So it was a very helpful thing for those. Therefore, there appears to be an inclination for people to believe when they see the supernatural. For many people, that was the case. So why doesn't God perform these miracles today so that people could know he's there? If God is alive, if he's there, if he's able, why doesn't he do it?
Yeah, good. That's right. So John chapter 12, some people didn't believe, some people do. The first thing I want to say about this is, so why doesn't God do miracles today? I find myself wanting to be very careful as I try and answer these questions. I'm not God. So how could who am I? I'm a nobody. Like seriously, I'm just a coastie who lives over at Sarah. How could a nobody from Sarah give an answer as to why God Now, all I can say, which is all you can say, which is all anyone can say about the unseen God, is what this unseen God has told us. Yeah. I don't have a direct line. I got this question. This is the point. A couple of questions. This unseen God has made himself known. How can I know anything about this unseen God unless he would reveal it? That's the way of relationships. What do you know about me? Well, I've offered a couple of things tonight. Like if you've never met me before, well, you now know where I live, you know how many kids I've got, you know I've enjoyed getting out of the water because I can't get to the gym. How do you know this? You only know this because I've told you. So when it comes to many of these questions that we have about God, all we can say is what God has said, which is why we come to the Bible. Now, the Bible has a lot to say, which is why we come at it. We love to come at it. We keep working at it. But God has said, I've done the most spectacular thing in history, and I've had eyewitnesses, not just one, not just two, but many eyewitnesses who would testify. It's been handed down to us. This is all thrown to next week's topic, actually. Has it been preserved or so that you might actually know me? So why doesn't God rock up into your lounge room right now? That's a question for God that I don't want to presume to answer. But what I can say is what God has said, and that is he's given us everything that we need to know that he is there through the record of the Bible, which is a historical record that God has broken into history.
Well, that might link into this last question I'm going to ask you. You jumped in before your presentation and when I said this question, why should it matter? It's not like he's intervening in any visible way in the world, but here's another question. I'll leave you with this. Why waste time on something you won't get an answer to? Surely there are more important and pressing problems in our world. Is there a God? How do you know him? This person's saying, why waste your time on something you're not going to get an answer to? There's bigger stuff going on.
Yeah. Well, I find it hard, not just personally, but that humanity has a bigger thing to wrap our heads around than an infinite God. Not that there's plenty of huge issues going on, but just the very concept of an infinite, almighty, or powerful can't get any bigger. But it's not just the bigness of God, it's the bigness of the implications. I hinted at it earlier. This affects all of life. Like, we rightly are doing a lot to care for the vulnerable right now, particularly the elderly. Why should we? Now, I'm not saying that we shouldn't, we absolutely should, but why should we? Now, if you stop to think about that, that then becomes a question of ethics. It becomes a question of human life and value and dignity. And underneath all of this is a belief about, is there a God or not? Now, there are people arguing that we should care for the vulnerable who don't believe there is a God, just as I, as a Christian, believe that we also... So you might say, oh, actually, you come to the same conclusion, but actually it doesn't take long to find out we will arrive at very different views on how to live based on whether we believe that there is a God who made our lives, who is watching, who is interested, and that we will actually stand before and give an account to. If that's true, that this life that I have has been given to me, and every moment of it has been sustained by this God, and that I'm actually going to meet him and give an account for what I've done, then, and that actually there's no bigger or a bigger consequence that could come of standing before this God having wasted this life. Oh, yeah, there's lots of big things to worry about in the world. But the eternal God says there's eternal consequences for the way that we've lived the lives that he's given us. Jesus says that over and over and over. So, man, the stakes couldn't be higher. To either disprove this as just religious mumbo jumbo, scaremongering, unenlightened thinking, but at least push it and prod it to be able to. But if it is true, if there is a God, and your heart just beat another time because he said beat, and you wake up to have another day tomorrow because he gave it to you, and that you would actually come before him, then surely there's no bigger issue to push into than whether that's true or not. And bigger implications for my next heartbeat, for my next day, which is what we're doing through this series. Yeah, we want to consider the implications of this stuff. So, yeah, more to be unpacked on that.
Yep, as Jez hinted to then, we want to be wrestling with big stuff because of the huge implications it has on all of our lives, if it's true or not. That's what we hope tonight's been helpful for, and what we hope next week and the following weeks are going to be. We've hinted at it a bunch of times tonight, how important it is that we know the Bible is true, because it's how we know God. And there's questions. It's an old book. Has it stood the test of time? Was it true in the first place? So a lot of good questions and stuff to think through. And if we're going to continue answering questions from the Bible, we need to know we can trust that. Hope you've enjoyed your time with us tonight. I have. And I look forward to joining with Jez again in one of the following weeks. But as I said before, you've got an opportunity to raise questions through the week. I'm going to put up a email address here. That might be covered by the phone number, I'm not sure. There you go. So you can text in, you can email that. You can probably comment on our Facebook feeds or something like that as well. Just write question for Monday night and we'll get that. But yeah, hopefully this has been helpful, and hopefully see you next week.
Catch up.